The first to fall had no time to run. The last ones learned to survive. But now something new is emerging, something faster, something smarter. The apocalypse could be just beginning. Like and subscribe before the next step in this story happens right around the corner. The night of the damned. The sky of Alvarado was filled with thick and dark clouds, announcing an imminent storm. The cold wind cut through the empty streets of the small town, where the population was already sleeping, oblivious to the nightmare that was about to unfold. It was a quiet place, where nothing extraordinary happened. But that night, something would awaken from the graves to claim the living. Rodrigo, the city's gravedigger, was finishing his last shift at the municipal cemetery. A solitary man, accustomed to the silence of the dead, he was responsible for opening and closing graves, as well as keeping the tombstones clean. That night, something seemed different. There was a strange smell in the air, something that went beyond the humidity of the approaching storm, an odor of rotten flesh, of overturned earth and recent death. He ignored the discomfort and made his way back home, not imagining that this would be the last time he would see the world as he knew it. The rain began to fall shortly after midnight. Thick drops crashed against the windows of the houses, the wind blew in strong gusts, and thunder rumbled in the sky. That was when the first scream cut through the night. On the outskirts of the city, an elderly woman named Donna Lourdes woke up to a strange noise coming from the backyard. His dog, an old German shepherd, growled into the darkness. Reluctantly, she got up and walked to the door, half opening it. Outside, through the mist and rain, he saw a staggering figure slowly approaching. He looked like a man, but his gait was clumsy, and his arms hung strangely at his sides. When the light from the streetlight hit her face, she gasped in horror. Her skin was grey, her eyes were empty, and her mouth was full of dirty teeth, chewing something that dripped with a thick black liquid. Before he could react, the being advanced. The dog jumped to protect her, but the creature pounced on the animal, tearing its flesh apart with enormous force. Donna Lourdes tried to run, but her weak legs did not obey her. The monster reached her, and her scream echoed throughout the neighborhood. At dawn, the city was different. A heavy silence hung over the streets. Houses were open, some doors were broken into. The few who went outside to check what was happening found blood trails, scattered clothes, and, worst of all, bodies moving slowly. They were the deceased from the local cemetery, but now they were no longer in their graves. They were walking corpses with rotting flesh, milky eyes, and an insatiable desire for human flesh. Rodrigo was the first to notice the horror. When he arrived at the cemetery that morning, he found overturned graves, broken coffins, and the earth scattered as if something had crawled out. The smell was unbearable. He barely had time to react before he heard a sound behind him. As he turned around, he saw something that made his heart stop, a figure he knew very well. It was his old friend, Mauricio, who had died months earlier in a car accident. But here he was, shuffling with a blank expression, his skin unraveling and his bones showing in spots. Rodrigo retreated, but Mauricio advanced, letting out a guttural moan. The gravedigger ran to his house, locking the door behind him and grabbing his rusty shotgun. What was going on? How was it possible that the dead had returned? News of the outbreak spread quickly among survivors. Small groups began to form, trying to find shelter and improvised weapons. The police tried to contain the advance of the creatures, but it soon became evident that ordinary shots were not enough. The dead simply kept moving forward unless they were hit in the head. Rodrigo joined a small group of residents, including Helena, the doctor at the health center, and Miguel, a former military man. They locked themselves in the church, one of the few solid buildings in the city. Inside, they tried to formulate a plan. Miguel explained that something similar had been recorded before, old stories of corpses rising after heavy rains. Helena, in turn, believed that it could be an infection brought by the soggy soil. While they were arguing, they heard a noise outside. Someone was knocking desperately on the door. When Rodrigo peeked through the crack, he saw a bloodied man, eyes wide with terror. He was screaming to be let in. Against the advice of the others, Rodrigo unlocked the door. The man stumbled inside, holding his bitten arm. His breathing was irregular, and the skin around the wound was already necrotic. Helena approached to help him, but it was too late. The man shuddered, and suddenly his eyes turned to a dull white. Within seconds, he was no longer human. His body convulsed before attacking the doctor with absurd ferocity. Miguel tried to pull it, but the creature was already biting Helena's face. Blood gushed out on the altar of the church as the screams echoed. Rodrigo grabbed an axe and struck a dry blow against the dead man's head, who fell lifeless for the second time. But Helena was injured. They knew what that meant. The infection spread rapidly. She begged to be killed before she transformed, but Rodrigo hesitated. Miguel, with no time for moral dilemmas, pointed the gun and finished the job. The group was smaller. The city was doomed. There were few survivors left. The streets were infested with decomposing corpses, wandering in search of fresh meat. The putrid smell was unbearable. Rodrigo and Miguel knew that staying there meant dying. They decided to flee along the main road, but the zombies were everywhere. Crossing the city was a nightmare. Every corner hid a new threat. The sound of shuffling footsteps came from all sides. Miguel was the first to fall, holding off a horde so Rodrigo could escape. His scream was short, interrupted by the sound of flesh being torn apart. Rodrigo ran to the city limits, where he found an old abandoned truck. With the last force he had left, he started the engine and accelerated away from that hell. But when she looked in the rearview mirror, her heart froze. Something was sitting in the back seat. The smell of rotting flesh filled the vehicle. A gurgling moan filled his ears. And then cold fingers touched his shoulder. The purge of the damned. The dirt road cut through the middle of the dense forest, where the trees writhed under the thick fog. The old school bus, now transformed into a tourist transport, rattled on the narrow trail as it took a group of travelers to Vila do Aguro, a forgotten village in the far reaches of Brazil's interior. The place was shrouded in legends, the best known of which said that its residents practiced ancient rituals, forbidden for centuries, to bring their dead back. Among the passengers were Ana, an investigative journalist, Marcos, a skeptical photographer, and Daniel, an anthropology student fascinated by myths. The trio was traveling with the intention of documenting the strange annual celebration that took place in that remote village. The locals called it the Night of the Invocation, an event where they revered their ancestors. What seemed to be just a folk tradition would soon turn out to be something much worse. When the bus finally arrived at the village, tourists were greeted by silent faces and suspicious looks. The wooden houses, old and worn, were decorated with candles and bones tied with red ribbons. In the center of the village, a large bonfire was already burning, illuminating the square where a huge stone statue represented a faceless entity. The smell of burning herbs hung in the air, mixed with the aroma of smoked meat. Anna noticed the discomfort of the residents. They whispered to each other, looking away whenever any of the visitors tried to interact. An elderly man with sunken eyes and a thin beard approached the group and, in a low voice, warned, "You shouldn't be here. Not tonight." Daniel, fascinated by the mystery, ignored the warning. He took his camera and started recording everything, but the feeling that they were being watched grew by the minute. The ceremony began at midnight. Villagers gathered around the campfire, murmuring songs in a forgotten language. The village elder held up an earthen chalice and chanted words that seemed to reverberate in the land itself. Then he poured the dark liquid on the floor. Silence fell over the village. The wind stopped. The fire from the bonfire wavered, and for a brief moment seemed to go out. That's when the earth began to shake. The tourists retreated, looking around confused. The ground cracked in places, and a putrid smell emerged from the crevices. The chants of the villagers intensified, and soon came the first cries. Something began to move in the cemetery behind the church. The sound of cracking wood echoed in the dark night. The lids of the coffins were being forced from the inside out. Bony hands, covered in rotting flesh, emerged from the damp ground. The dead were coming back. Anna was paralyzed as she saw the first corpses rise. Their empty eyes reflected the glow of the fire. The flesh hung from their bones, and their mouths opened in unintelligible whispers. One of them crawled up to one of the villagers and grabbed him tightly. The man screamed, but soon his voice was silenced by the sound of teeth sinking into his neck. Panic gripped the village. The tourists rushed towards the bus, but found the driver dead, his throat ripped. Residents screamed as they were attacked by those who, until then, were their ancestors. The ritual had not brought benevolent spirits back. He had released something terrible. Mark tried to help a young woman who was surrounded by 3 walking corpses, but as soon as he approached, a rotten hand clung to his ankle. He fell, and the zombies dragged him into the darkness. Anna and Daniel fled into one of the houses, locking the door behind them. The sounds of flesh being torn apart outside were nauseating. The smell of death permeated the air. Daniel trembled, trying to formulate a plan, but Anna only stared out the window, watching the village being swallowed by darkness. Then the door creaked. The zombies were there. Daniel's screams echoed in the small house as cadaverous hands grabbed him, pulling him to his death. Anna ran to the attic, trapping the ladder behind her. He could hear the dead crawling around the house, looking for any trace of life. She covered her mouth with her hands, holding her breath. Hours passed. The sun rose slowly, bathing the village in a dim and morbid light. The fire had gone out. Silence reigned. Anna came down cautiously. The village was in ruins. Shattered bodies covered the ground. The smell of blood hung in the air. She walked through the deserted streets, trying to understand if it was over. That's when he saw the eyes, inside the houses, in the shadows of the trees, in the broken windows. Hundreds of opaque eyes watched her. The dead were still there, motionless, waiting. The ritual was not over. Anna started running, and behind her the dead began to follow her. The March of the Forgotten. The Santa Esperanza Asylum was isolated on top of a hill, surrounded by a dense forest forgotten by time. Most of the inmates had not received visitors for years. They were elderly people who had been left behind, condemned to wait for death in a cold and memoryless environment. But that night, death would not come to take them. She would come to bring them back. Nurse Ricardo did his night shift, walking through the narrow corridors of the nursing home with his flashlight. The lights flickered due to a storm brewing outside. The rain fell heavily on the roof, and the wind howled through the old windows. He hated that place. The musty smell mixed with the smell of medicine made her stomach turn. But a job was a job. As he passed through room 206, Ricardo noticed something strange. The door was ajar, and a low, damp noise came from within. He pushed the door slowly and pointed the flashlight inward. His heart stopped. Mr. Albino, one of the oldest patients, was sitting on the bed with his back turned. The problem was that Albino had died that morning. Ricardo retreated, feeling a lump in his throat. The old man's body moved slowly, emitting a horrible crack, like bones adjusting the wrong way. When Albino turned his head, his eyes were milky, his wrinkled skin now grey. His mouth opened in a low, hungry moan. Ricardo tried to run, but the old man moved with a speed impossible for someone who, hours before, was dead. The nurse's cry echoed through the corridors. Other inmates began to wake up to the noises. But it wasn't just Ricardo who screamed. The dead were awakening. One by one, the elderly who had died in the last few months rose from their beds, bodies in an advanced state of decomposition, the skin hanging from the bones, moans escaping from their parched mouths. They were no longer helpless old men. They were hungry predators. Nursing assistant Vanessa, hearing the screams, ran out of the break room. She saw Ricardo being dragged into the room while a tide of putrefied bodies advanced through the corridors. Panic took hold of her. He ran to the director's office, trying to use the phone, but the storm had knocked down the lines. He took the keys to the emergency van and tried to flee, but when he reached the parking lot, the dead were already there, blocking the exit. The few employees who were in the asylum tried to lock themselves in the administrative rooms, but the dead were persistent. They didn't run, they just advanced at a dragged and relentless pace. They felt no pain, they did not need to rest. They just marched, their eyes empty and their mouths twisted in an eternal hunger. The survivors were reduced one by one. Vanessa hid in the psychiatric ward, where the most debilitated inmates were isolated. She covered her mouth so as not to scream when she saw one of the dead tearing a nurse's throat with his teeth. Blood gushed out, dyeing the white walls red. There was nowhere to run. The clock was 3 a.m. when the generator failed. The lights went out for good, plunging the asylum into total darkness. The only sound was the dragging of rotten feet on the ground and the groans of the condemned. Vanessa found a service ladder and tried to climb up to the attic. Maybe he could hide there until dawn, but when she opened the attic door, she realized too late that she was not alone. The corpses were already there, waiting. The next morning, fog covered the hill and silence reigned over the Santa Esperanza asylum. No sign of life was left there. The police were called by family members who were surprised by the lack of contact. When the officers arrived, they found the asylum empty. No bodies, no evidence of violence, only messy rooms, stained sheets, and strange marks on the walls. The patients' records were burned. To the outside world, the asylum seemed abandoned for years. With no clues as to the whereabouts of the employees or inmates, the case was filed as a mass disappearance. The place was sealed and left to rot. Months later, urban explorers decided to storm the building to film the abandoned site. Between dark corridors and dusty furniture, one of the cameras captured something that no one could explain. A corridor, once empty, was now filled with dozens of silhouettes. Thin, hunched figures, their milky eyes fixed on the camera, their bodies twisted, waiting as if they had never left. And then, a low, wet sound filled the room. The dead were still marching. Road of no return. The dawn was dense and silent on Highway 319, a forgotten stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through a dense forest, connecting 2 small towns in the countryside. Few dared to travel there at night, not only because of the precarious road, but because of the frightening stories that circulated among the residents of the region. Stories of missing truck drivers, abandoned cars with no trace of their owners, and whispers that came from the dense forest. 5 friends, Marina, Lucas, Renan, Paula, and Gustavo, ignored the local warnings. They were returning from a music festival and decided to take that route to shorten the trip. Inside the car, the conversation and laughter tried to ward off the discomfort of the oppressive darkness around. The radio sizzled with no signal, and the GPS failed, showing only a frozen screen. Marina, at the wheel, strained her eyes to see through the low fog that began to cover the road. It was then that it happened. Something emerged in the middle of the asphalt. Marina screamed and spun the steering wheel hard. The car skidded, left the road and crashed into a dirt ravine. The engine died. The 5 of them stood still, their hearts racing. Lucas, in the passenger seat, looked back trying to understand what they had seen, but there was nothing on the road. "What the hell was that?" Renan asked, massaging his shoulder. I think it was an animal, or a person," Marina replied, still with trembling hands on the steering wheel. "Guys, there's blood on the hood," Paula said, pointing to the front of the car. Silence fell over them. No sound of crickets or the wind, just the suffocating stillness of the forest. Gustavo, the bravest of the group, got out of the car with a flashlight. The light flickered in his hands as he inspected the front of the vehicle. The bumper was dented and covered in a dark liquid, but there was no sign of a body. It was then that they heard the first moan, coming from the forest, low and dragged, as if something is moving slowly through the trees. A chill ran down everyone's spine. "Get in the car now!" Lucas shouted. Gustavo took 2 steps back, and before he could react, A pale, rotten hand came out of the darkness and grabbed his ankle. He screamed, trying to free himself, but another hand emerged, grabbing his shirt and pulling him hard into the woods. The others only heard Gustavo's screams disappearing into the darkness. Panic gripped the group. Marina tried to start the car, but the engine just roared, failing miserably. The moans grew louder. Something was creeping out of the forest. Shadows began to appear on the road. They were people, or what was left of them, decomposing bodies, the skin hanging from the bones, the milky eyes reflecting the dim light of the lighthouse. They moved slowly, but with a macabre purpose. Paula began to cry, while Lucas tried to lock all the car doors. Renan took a flashlight and pointed it at the creatures. The light revealed expressionless faces, open mouths in a continuous hungry murmur, and then a detail that made his blood run cold. The clothes of some of those things. They were uniforms of road workers, truck drivers, people who, according to legends, had disappeared there. Gustavo was among them now. His body, which had been dragged minutes earlier, was standing next to the creatures. His head tilted the wrong way, as if his neck had been broken, but he moved. His lifeless eyes stared at his friends in the car. "That's not happening," whispered Marina. The car was surrounded. Bony hands hit the glass, leaving marks of dried blood. The dead wanted to enter. "We have to get out of here," Lucas shouted. Renan grabbed a baseball bat in the trunk and opened the car door suddenly, hitting the head of the first creature that tried to grab him. The skull sank with a wet sound, but the others continued advancing. He signaled for his friends to follow. The four ran through the bush, dodging the trees, while the dead chased them slowly but without ever stopping. The moans continued to echo in the night. Lucas stumbled and fell, and before he could get up, he felt cold hands grabbing his legs. He screamed as a fetid mouth approached his face. Renan tried to pull him, but one of the dead grabbed him by the arm and bit him. The flesh tore apart. The scream was terrible. Marina and Paula ran without looking back. They reached an abandoned gas station on the side of the road. The place smelled of old oil and rust. They hid inside the convenience store, panting. Inside, Marina took an old phone and tried to dial the police. No signal. The dead were approaching. Paula found a door at the back that led to the warehouse. They locked the main entrance and ran there, but as soon as they closed the metal door, they realized that something was wrong. The smell inside was unbearable, and then they saw it. Bodies piled up in the corner of the room. Some were still moving faintly. People who had tried to hide before them, people who had not been able to escape. Before they could react, they heard a low sound. Something brushed against the ground outside. The dead were there. The noise of fingernails scratching metal filled the room. The moans grew louder, and then the door began to open. The first body advanced, and screams took over the night. Silence took over the gas station shortly after. The metal door swayed slightly in the night breeze. The only sound left was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the shuffling footsteps that drifted away along the road. The next morning, a truck driver found the car abandoned on the side of the highway. The doors were open, the benches stained with dried blood. There were no signs of Marina, Paula, Lucas or Renan. But a few miles ahead, in the dense forest, rotten footprints mingled with the recent marks of bare feet, and the whispers echoed again among the trees. The Black Well Ritual. The village of Cernovoda, Romania, was a small, isolated place surrounded by dense forests and steep hills. Few travelers ventured into those lands, and those who did rarely stayed long. Residents were reserved, spoke in whispers, and avoided certain areas of the village, especially the old Black Well, located in the middle of the central square. It was said that this well had been there for centuries, long before the first houses were erected. It had been sealed with heavy stone slabs, and strange marks were carved around it. No residents touched him, and children were forbidden to play nearby. When asked why, the elders looked away and said only one sentence: "The dead should sleep." However, on a cold October night, a group of archaeologists arrived in the village. Led by Professor Anton Vasile, they were in search of ancient relics and decided that the mysterious well might hold valuable secrets. Against the protests of the residents, they began the excavation. It was a fatal mistake. The moment they removed the last stone that sealed the entrance to the well, an unbearable odor emerged from the depths, like decaying flesh mixed with damp earth. The wind blew hard, as if a sigh had been released from the bottom of that forgotten hole. The villagers in the distance began to pray, closing doors and windows. Anton lit a flashlight and peered inside. All he saw was darkness, an emptiness so deep it seemed to devour the light. It was then that they heard the first sound, a low, guttural murmur coming from inside. One of the assistants, Ayanku, stepped back and whispered, "Something's there." "It's just the echo," Anton replied, trying to hide his nervousness. But it wasn't. That night, the village was seized by indescribable terror. At midnight, the church bells rang by themselves, the dogs began to howl, and the lamps flickered as if an invisible shadow passed between the houses. It was then that the first screams came. The dead were awakening. They were former villagers, twisted skeletal bodies that emerged from the ground like puppets of rotting flesh. Their mouths murmured songs in a forgotten language, and their empty eyes shone in the darkness. Anton and his team rushed to the inn where they were staying, but the dead followed them, moving slowly but never stopping. One of the assistants was captured before reaching the door. He screamed as skeletal hands grabbed him and pulled him into the shadows. When the archaeologists looked back, he was no longer there. The survivors locked the doors and piled up furniture like barricades. Outside, the dead circled, whispering, waiting. Professor Anton trembled, holding an old book he had found during his research. The pages talked about the black pit and the sealing ritual. According to the text, the well was a portal between the living and the damned. It should never be opened, but now it was too late. A loud knock shook the door. Something wanted to come in. The windows began to crack, and a rotten smell invaded the room. Paula, one of the archaeologists, held a crucifix and prayed softly. Anton desperately flipped through the pages of the book, looking for a way to reverse the disaster. And then he found the only way to contain the dead was to restore the seal. But that required a blood sacrifice. "Someone needs to go into the well and seal it inside," Anton said, his voice cracking. No one answered. Everyone looked at each other in silence. The bang at the door grew louder. She wouldn't hold out for long. It was then that Anton made his decision. He took a rope and tied it around his waist. With no time to argue, he ran outside, dodging the cadaverous hands that tried to grab him. He reached the well and began to descend, the smell of death growing more intense with each meter. The pitch was absolute. Down there he saw it, a shapeless mass of twisted flesh and bones, something that writhed and whispered in agony. Anton's heart almost stopped. The creature raised its face, or something that resembled a face, and hissed its name. With a cry of despair, Anton opened the book and began to recite the ancient words. The well shook. The creature roared, and above it, the dead began to crumble into dust. The stone walls moved, closing slowly. The archaeologists who stayed in the village watched in horror as the ground swallowed the well, as if it had never existed. The dead dissolved into thin air, and the village was plunged into sepulchral silence. Anton never returned. The next morning, the villagers left their homes, cautious. The well was resealed, and there was no sign of the teacher. The survivors of the group left the village immediately, without looking back. The residents did not stop them. In the square, the old stones returned to cover the entrance to the well. No villager spoke about what had happened, and life took its course, as it had always been. But sometimes, during the night, if one paid close attention, one could swear that one still heard a whisper coming from underground. Anton's name, called by the darkness, the curse of the renegades. The village of Black Hollow has always been avoided by travelers. Located among misty mountains and ancient forests, its history was full of dark secrets. It was said that centuries ago, a group of heretics was expelled from the region and executed in an old monastery in the hills. But before they died, they placed a curse on the village, vowing to return when the blood moon rose again. And that night, the moon shone in a deep shade of crimson. Jonas Carter, an investigative journalist, arrived in the village accompanied by his team, Sarah, an expert in occult history, and David, a cameraman. They were there to document the legend of the Curse of the Renegades. The local mayor, an old man with a restless look, received them reluctantly. He asked them to leave before nightfall. "No one should be here after midnight," he warned, his voice trembling. "The dead march when the moon is high." The outsiders ignored the warning. They climbed to the ruins of the monastery where the executions had taken place. The structure was in ruins, taken by moss and the icy wind. In the center, they found a black stone altar covered in marks that seemed to move under the red light of the moon. David set up the camera while Sarah examined the symbols. His eyes widened. "This isn't just an altar. It's a seal," she whispered. Before they could react, thunder rumbled and the ground shook. The wind grew stronger, loaded with a rotten smell. Something was awakening. From deep in the shadows, bodies began to emerge. They wore the rotting robes of ancient monks and soldiers, but their faces were disfigured, consumed by time. His empty eyes glowed a sickly shade of amber. They stood, moving slowly but with a clear purpose: to kill the living. Jonas grabbed Sarah and David, pulling them back onto the trail, but the dead were many. One of them grabbed David by the arm. The cameraman screamed, but the creature was quick, sinking yellow teeth into its throat. Blood splattered, and the screams were choked by the wind. Jonas and Sarah ran back to the village, their hearts racing. But when they arrived, they realized the final horror. The dead were already there. Villagers were pulled out of their homes, their voices being silenced in the darkness. The mayor found them, holding an axe with trembling hands. "You have released the curse. Now there is no escape." He raised his blade at Jonah, blaming him for the disaster. But before he could attack, rotten hands pulled him back. His scream echoed through the night as he was dragged into the shadows, disappearing forever. Sarah pulled Jonah into the church, locking the doors behind them. The last refuge in the village was surrounded. The groans of the dead echoed outside. "The altar? It was a seal," Sarah said, panting. "If we can restore it, maybe we can stop it." But the price to seal the portal required a blood sacrifice. Jonas realized what needed to be done. He picked up an ancient dagger from the altar and looked at Sarah with a parting look. "If I volunteer, the curse can be contained. You need to finish what we started." Before Sarah could protest, Jonas plunged the blade into his own chest, letting his blood drip onto the sacred symbols. The church shook, and a wave of energy swept through the village. The dead began to scream, their forms dissolving into dust as they were sucked back into the afterlife. Silence fell over Black Hollow. Sarah, now alone, looked at Jonas's lifeless body. The price of redemption had been paid. The village was saved, at least until the blood moon rose again. And in the distance, on the altar of the hill, a shadow stood watching, waiting for the day when the curse might be reborn.